Welcome to the very first episode of the CILT UK podcast. This is our new show where leading voices from across transport, logistics and the supply chain come together to tackle the big topics shaping our profession. If you don't know me, I'm Anna Jane Hunter, the chair of CILT UK, and it's absolutely fantastic to have you with us as we kick off this brand new space for bold conversations, fresh insight and real-world perspectives. For anyone who isn't familiar with CILT UK, we're the Institute of Logistics and Transport in the UK, the professional home for the people who keep the country moving. We drive standards, support careers, and we speak up on the issues that matter most to our community. In short, we're here to champion the profession. We're professionalising the profession, and we're here to be its collective voice. As for me, I'm proud to serve as chair of CILT UK, and I'm from a transport background, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the rest of it. I actually started my career as a barrister before joining the rail industry 19 years ago, and I'm a fellow of the Institute with leadership experience across both sides of rail on infrastructure and train operating. For the last 5 years, I've worked independently in operations as a consultant, and I specialise in stakeholder relationships, safety and performance, all driven by a passion for connecting people and pushing our profession forward. So, before we get into today's discussion, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by two fantastic guests. They'll be sharing their thoughts on what's happening in the industry at the moment and helping us unpack some of the big policy announcements of this week and recent times. So, shall I introduce you guys? First of all, my first guest is Ian Wainwright. Ian's a fellow of the Institute and he's chair of our Freight and Logistics Policy Group. And he's also a member of the Transport Planning Society. He sits on the Welsh Government's Air Quality Review Panel and advises the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight and Smart Freight Centre. Ian's had 18 years working across major third-party logistic contracts before joining Transport for London, which is the bit where we overlap. And he spent 11 years shaping the city's freight agenda. Our second guest is Steve Goodin, and he's the director of the RAC Foundation. This is an independent motoring research charity whose work spans electric vehicle uptake, road safety, and the state of the nation's roads. He took on this role in 2015 after a long civil service career, and having joined in 1983 and moving to the Department for Transport in 1987, where he served as a private secretary to several transport ministers. I'm sure we'll get into that later in the discussion. Steve also served as president of CILT UK in 2021 to 22 and as a visiting professor at the University of the West of England. So guys, it would be remiss of us to not start our discussion today without talking about EVs, I guess. And Steve, you've spent your career at the centre of national transport policy, and Ian, your work obviously spans the full spectrum of freight and logistics. So I want to start there in our discussion, and from the economics of EV adoption for private motorists, commercial fleets, to the fleet choices. With your experience, guys, how fair or sensible do you think a 3p per mile tax on EVs is compared with some of the existing fuel duty and taxation arrangements we have in place? Steve, can I start with you, please?
Sure. Well, I think the first question has always got to be whether it's fair to have a tax at all, a particular tax. And in this instance, we've long said from the Foundation that there's nothing cast in stone that says that motoring should be a net contributor to the exchequer. But if there is such a decision, and that's a decision that our Chancellor, our current government has taken, then there's no particular reason, I think, for excluding a group of drivers from that regime. So is it fair to have a charge for electric vehicles? Well, if you're going to charge vehicles, they're using the roads just like all the others. And I think the third thing then becomes, well, if you're going to do that, can you do it in a way that's straightforward, simple, that people can engage with? And bear in mind, however much that charge is, that's going to be a significant cost for the people who are paying it. So make sure that you're pitching the charge at a sensible level. And you've got to see it in the context. You've mentioned it. There are many other taxes that play into this picture as well. I should say the Chancellor's announcement only applies to cars. It doesn't apply to vans. It doesn't apply to the rest of the logistics sector. So thinking of deliveries as well as heavy freight are explicitly excluded by what the Chancellor's announced.
And do you think that might be an opportunity missed then, Ian, from your perspective, from the sort of the logistics side? You're thinking about vans more than cars.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, but the issue with electric vehicles is that the manufacturers produce a lot fewer HGVs than they do cars. there are very, very few HGVs out there that are electric, and they're at least twice the price of the purchase price. So the issue is there's not the opportunities to change easily at the moment in an affordable way for a logistics professional it is really small profit margins. There's a lot of competition out there. If you're talking about vans, anybody can drive a van who can drive a car. You can set yourself up as a logistics, van delivery driver tomorrow. The issue with all of this stuff is there's a big tax pot, which is, we pay taxes in various ways. There has to be something that says what gets contributed to in terms of the money going in from various transport users, how does that come back out and how does it play? The issue with the EV transition and changing to 3p per mile, we need a better scheme that deals with all road transport and how that is fairly priced. Because you've got to look at where the incentives are coming and the behaviours of the people using those vehicles. So yes, shift it to electric vehicles, but actually what's happening in the tax as a whole, is there a form of road user charge coming that's going to be across all transport? What does that look like? What time of day, etc., etc.?
So where do we think this sits then in terms of push and pull? Because, taxes can push people towards a behaviour, or they can, pull them in a different direction. And do we see this as being part of transitioning people over to EV? Maybe it's disincentivising them after a period of them being incentivised. Where do you think that sits, Steve, in terms of how people are going to perceive this? What's it intended for? Or is it just about raising money?
Well, I start by saying, let's be clear, the Chancellor wants to raise some money. She's been very clear about that. I think we've got to bear in mind that this is as simple as possible as they can make it. So at the moment, if you're driving a motor vehicle on the roads of this country and you're using petrol or diesel, you're paying fuel duty. This is simply backfilling the fuel duty that's ebbing away as the transition to electric motoring comes along. And whether that's going to completely take away fossil fuel for the logistics sector in its entirety for the heavier vehicles, whereas Ian has said it's a lot more difficult at the moment, the vehicles aren't really there, we're talking about a particular pattern of use, then we'll have to see how that plays out. But going for something that simply says at the moment the amount of tax you pay in fuel duty relates to the number of miles you drive, tell you what, we're just going to tax you for the number of miles you drive in future. I think that makes a lot of sense to keep it very simple. The other thing, of course, though, that the Chancellor announced was that as of next autumn, fuel duty is going up. So
right.
If we're thinking about fairness and the balance between electric and petrol, then anyone who is concerned that this might put a brake on the take-up of electric vehicles needs to have an eye to the fact that fuel duty, for the first time since 2011, is going to start going up again.
So that works for cars and for personal cars, as you said. It doesn't apply to larger vehicles. And will that be enough then, Ian? If they're going to freeze the fuel from next year, that takes care of that transition for personal car use over to electric. But where are the incentives for those van drivers you've touched on and those HGVs?
It's almost non-existent, and that's been the way all the way through. We've even from changes to emissions and such like. So you end up with something like the London low emission zone. Even that, the scrappage allowances for small businesses, particularly small van drivers and tradespeople using vans for their work, is very small. That pot. I mean, it's like with the EV transition on cars. There's been talk about this, incentivizing EV uptake and stuff. But the whole issue has got to be, we've got to stand back from it and say, if in 10 years' time the majority of transport is electric, with some older vehicles still with some petrol and diesel, or there may be other alternative fuels, what does that look like overall, and what should the charging be for that to incentivise the right transport at the right time? Because we know that, yes, delivery is often coming in first thing in the morning, but by the same token, that's when the school run's taking place. And one of the biggest issues on congestion is the school run.
Yeah, still, yeah.
So we have to work out, what are we trying to do? There's a black hole that the Chancellor says she's tried to fill it through, and they'll tax wherever, but we haven't got a strategy that says this is the way forward for the long term, regardless of what fuel we're using.
And at CILT UK, we try to be kind of fact-led, based on research and that sort of thing. So do we have a point of reference for this, Steve? I'm thinking of things we've gone through before in the past. For instance, when I was a child, I remember, horrible leaded petrol, and then we moved away from that. We've tried to sort of move people away from diesel a bit and towards unleaded. So do we have a point of reference for how long this might take? Ian mentioned 10 years for us to get to more electric use. Do we know how long this is going to take?
I think the real joker in the pack here, and this is really significant for the CILT membership, is the fact that it's one thing to have incentives to move on to electric vehicles, electric battery-powered vehicles, and quite another one for them to be there to buy. And what we're seeing is a really radical technological transformation from the way that we've designed the powertrain of lorries for the last 50, 60, 70 years or more. And what we haven't got yet is the very clear winner in that technological race. And I would draw a parallel actually with aviation, for example, where at the moment I don't think anybody is expecting battery electric to be the answer for aviation. We're looking at other options. We're looking at synthetic fuel. We're looking at sustainable aviation fuel. And maybe that might have a part to play in, particularly I'm thinking the long-haul logistics sector, the really big trucks, and we just don't know yet. So how long is that transition going to take? It's really hard to say, and that creates the uncertainty, doesn't it?
And there's other transitions going on. So rail freight has always been seen as something for moving, steel and aggregates and big heavy stuff. There's a lot more uptake from the supermarkets moving stuff, even on quite short runs, because there's now there's an incentive to do it from the climate change perspective, but there's also a financial incentive. The issue is you need to be able to do that in bulk with a lot of things.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily there for every single commodity that you could potentially move around. And unfortunately, policymakers tend to be obsessed with parcels because that's what they get, what they see themselves. They don't think about the food to the supermarket or the shop in the first place, or the delivery to the restaurant, or the offices we're still running. We're paperwork in places, So there's things that are moving around that people aren't thinking about how they plan this. And that's why I say, if all we worry about is, well, are we going to incentivize, person A to move to an electric vehicle? That's not really tackling the issue. We've got to say, how do we see this future? And I think sometimes there's not enough looking forward long enough, probably beyond the life of a single parliament or such like, that actually we know where we're going.
Well, there's a big difference there, isn't there, between the life of a parliament, circa 5 years, and some of the assets that we're talking about, whether it's, in my sector in rail, whether it's in road, whether it's in logistics or in the rail freight and aviation sector you've both mentioned. These are 40-plus year assets that you're asking people to invest in. And even your small guy with his van that you mentioned, Ian, it's a big investment for people, isn't it?
It is. It's a huge part of the cost. And there are lots of other models that are coming along. So there's a lot more in terms of sort of, lease agreements and things, which are sort of moving into the car market as well. But I think it's about how, what's the long-term aim of all of this? How do we get there? And considering how we live ourselves. Because part of this is about how we're moving around. There's a push to try and get more people walking and cycling. Well, that's fine. But can you actually get the deliveries in around those activities? When is it happening? Where is it happening?
And maybe that's a really good time, and we thought this might happen when we were planning, that we'd naturally segue into what is our second topic that we want to talk about today, which is congestion, isn't it? And Ian, really, that's something that you know an awful lot about, don't you? And you started touching on some of the points there around, it's about how people move around, isn't it? And our traditional understanding of the causes of congestion, the blockers to unblocking it, it's really changing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it becomes very clear when you're looking at it from logistics, because the roads are there 24/7. If you've got a vehicle, you own it 24/7. And if you think about those distribution companies, they're trying to move things 24/7 because that's the way they make it as cheap as possible. We all get told, oh, this is a free delivery on something. That doesn't exist. Free delivery does not exist. If you ever believe it does, then you're slightly lacking, because part of this is, yes, there's a cost because the driver gets paid. The vehicle's using fuel, whether it's electricity or whether it diesel or whatever. You've also got the fact then that there are societal costs around that. There's congestion. a vehicle on the road is starting to then cause a problem potentially for another one. If there's an incident on the road, a collision on the road, that knocks other stuff back. But the big issue with congestion is it's certain times on certain days of the week. The shift from more people working from home. If you take the patterns in London, which I know the best, having worked for TfL, but you end up with Saturday from about 10 o'clock in the morning, the traffic's as bad or worse on Saturday than it is on a working day, and on a Sunday from midday onwards. And you go, this is just crazy. Too many people are still trying to drive around, as well as encourage people to have nice places to live, nice places to work.
So there's a lot in there. Let's unpack some of that then. So you mentioned the sort of the facade of free delivery, which I admit I've fallen for. You click on your Amazon Prime, other providers are available, but it promises to have it here for me tomorrow, free of charge because I pay my subscription.
Did you need it tomorrow?
Well, so there's a lot in there, isn't there? Do I need it tomorrow? How are the costs built into that? And are we moving towards maybe a place where it won't all be free? They'll try and incentivize me to have a delivery, during the night or, on a quieter day. Do we know enough about congestion patterns to be able to offer that to the consumer?
I think part of it is what's possible as a person. I mean, you can see that now with like home deliveries of groceries. So they start from 7 a.m. and they go through to 11 o'clock at night. If you had a corner shop and you were trying to make a delivery to that corner shop, the chances are from 7 p.m. in the evening, you'd be told, oh, you can't make a delivery, it's too noisy. And the planning restriction would have put something in that says after 7 o'clock, you can't deliver it. But if next door, the house can have a grocery delivery until 11 o'clock at night, you go, well, this doesn't quite work. If you go for individual delivery, in Poland, 56% of people prefer to go and pick stuff up from a locker box. In the UK, that's 9%.
Wow.
There's a very big difference between how people expect stuff to happen. And I do think there's a bit of, sometimes we expect everything on a plate, and whether we should have that.
We're just quite needy, are we? I mean, how do they do it, Steve? I don't know if this is something you know about, but I often wonder when I click and I say I want it tomorrow morning. I mean, I live in Liverpool. Okay, there's some pretty big distribution locations relatively near me in, say, Warrington and what have you. But it still amazes me they can have exactly the product that I want to buy at my door, in less than 24 hours. This is huge, isn't it? That they can do this nowadays. But I expect it of them as a consumer. How do they do it?
Well, it is one of the wonders, I think, of the modern world that the logistics sector, our sector, has created a world where, indeed, you can click on something that you quite fancy buying one evening and find that it's turned up the next day, which is extraordinary when you think about the range of things that are being fed through that system. But it is the case that some of the companies are already offering a different price if you're willing to wait a few days for something to be delivered. And I suspect that might make its way through. The real issue for the companies is, of course, if you're competing with other businesses to sell similar products and they're offering free delivery, then perhaps you feel obliged to offer free delivery. But as Ian says, there's no such thing as a free lunch here. The cost is being borne somewhere in the system. It just might not be visible to you.
So those market forces might sort this out a bit then, because people might fancy the cheaper price if they can wait 3 days or whatever.
It's retail, and retail is about really tight competition. I mean, you think about the competition between the British supermarkets.
Yeah.
Why have we got very few, very few options? Because they really compete, and they compete on price, and that's about bulk. And that's exactly what every other person's doing. So, if you go back 15 years, Amazon didn't have big warehouses in the UK. They've now got acres of the damn things. If you look at Shein and Temu, because and this has been happening in other countries as well, they have now started to look at building and using warehouses in the UK rather than shipping everything direct from China. So part of this is once you establish enough volume, you bring it over, you then start to dominate, and then it's a question of what's happening to the high street. What's happening to the restaurants because people are getting food deliveries. There's a societal thing there as well. But the congestion issue is it's certain times a day, and we need to just try and increase that.
So I'm going to get onto my bugbear about congestion now, which has nothing to do with retail and all to do with schools, which you mentioned in our first topic area, Ian. So how do we how do we get around that as a societal shift then? Where I live, there's at least half a dozen pretty big schools within about a mile of me, and I can tell you it is an absolute nightmare at certain times of day, Monday to Friday, because, you know, the little darlings have to be dropped off and picked up, don't they? And there are no school buses, or very few school buses. And people obviously then time their getting to work, or they're doing whatever they else need to do with their day around dropping their kids off and picking them up. So is that a societal shift we should be looking at? Is how do we change before and after school clubs, or, you know, the opening hours of other things that are built around schools? I don't know, is that too controversial, guys? Am I being too blue sky here?
Well, I think we have to bear in mind that we are in a state of flux. Post-COVID particularly, we have seen some changes to working patterns. We've seen, for example, I came here to this interview on a train and a tube, which I suspect 5-6 years ago would have been standing room only, and this morning absolutely wasn't. So we're seeing some changes happening already. The point I always used to make when I was working on congestion, which was a much bigger issue in the early 2000s than it has been recently, maybe it's coming back, is that speaking at the time as a parent, there was no trip that I made that was more stressful than getting my children to school on time. And frankly, if it made lots of other people slightly late for work, I was okay with that. Now, how we fit around all of the various things that we're doing, and I think you highlight the school trip. What if we turn that question on its head for a minute and say, if you're a parent and you've got 2 children or more, you don't really want to have staggered start times for the schools. You don't want them all going to different parts of the town or the city. So let's just work around the probability that that's when schools are going to start. Then what else do we change? And one of them is we do what we can to encourage active travel. We make it easier and safer for children to walk to school, to cycle to school, perhaps to get the bus to school, to think about the urban transport mix in the round. I think that's got to be a big part of it. Maybe there is some role for out-of-school events, but I still would say there's nothing quite like finding that one of your children is going to an after-school club, so you have to pick one up, and then you go home, and then you go back to pick up another one, which is just making things worse. So nothing's ever very straightforward.
And do you see much of that happening, Ian, around that kind of active travel? I know you've done some work on this.
So there's lots. I mean, you often see. So certainly in towns and cities, you see a lot of primary school children on scooters. You know, I don't mean the electric scooters. I just mean the ordinary scooters. And that's partly about getting them familiar with sort of almost powering themselves. It's a mental thing of almost starting that soon. And part of that is about encouraging them to have some independence, but also to want to walk to school, because obviously as a parent, you can't then drive them to school if they've got their scooter. Then that starts to transition, and you do some stuff about cycle training. And then you start to get to the point where you've got people who are moving around. And I say this is particularly urban and suburban areas. The issue we've got is how do you deal with some of that in the rural space, where you've got there's no street lights, there's no pavements. So I think part of this thing is we can't just sort of assume active travel, that's just for people within a sort of an urban environment. One of the big things is how do you facilitate that, and part of that is about going back to congestion, what time things are happening across the day, and also making sure there is space for things to happen at different times. So there's lots of things about putting in new cycle lanes. Great. The issue is if you've got a pub there, is there a loading bay for that pub to get a delivery? It's how we build this stuff together, because we all use the same space.
Yeah, you showed me a great photo example of that. I remember in a presentation you did where there's this pub with, a lovely cycle lane outside of it and a great big delivery with loads of beer kegs being unloaded. Yeah. And it's a really good visual example of that. There must be loads of those all over the place.
There's one or two, yes.
So, guys, we've covered a lot there in terms of EV charging and congestion. And in amongst all this, there's some really meaty topics for the sector. And that relies on good people, doesn't it? And we know we've got some skill shortages, across what we do, haven't we? So what's your thoughts on where some of those gaps are and what challenges we've got coming up? Steve, talk to me about talent.
Well, I think across the industrial base of the country, we've all started to realise that we're going to need some different skills in future. I'm just thinking AI, just to pick an obvious example, but we're going to need different skills perhaps to the ones we've traditionally had. What we mustn't lose sight of is And we also have some skills issues on jobs that we're very familiar with. And everyone listening to this podcast, I'm sure, will be familiar with the challenges we've had with driver shortages and getting enough people to drive the vehicles that we're absolutely dependent on. So we need to make sure we don't lose sight of what is going to be necessary to attract people into the jobs right across the sector.
And what do you think some of those blockers are, Ian? Because you mentioned in your world, you can buy a van tomorrow and you can turn yourself into a logistics provider. So it's an easy point of entry in some ways. But what are some of the blockers to us having the right talent in the right places in the sector?
So partly there's a cost issue. A lot of people that are in logistics perhaps haven't got that sort of formal educational sort of, they've not gone to degree level or something. But part of it is there was always a way of evolving people through. A lot of people who run transport companies, used to be drivers. Sometimes they're still drivers if in emergency. But it costs money. To put somebody through HGV training costs money. There is also this thing of how much profit can you make on this? It's nobody wants to pay for delivery, as we said earlier. So if you haven't got that float it's very difficult to develop talent in-house. And I think that's part of it, is how do we try and enable that across the industry so that we're delivering those skills, but also so that we actually attract in some people who maybe have the more technical skills, as Steve said. Mechanization in warehouses, whether that be, automatic sort of reach trucks and things, as sort of the standard level. People are now using drones to do stock checks in high bay warehouses. There's a load of stuff about the prediction of stock levels. When you're trying to factor in, well, where am I getting this from and how long is it going to take to get to me? There's big issues there. So if you're getting stuff from East Asia, or you're getting fresh produce from South America, well, how's that getting to me, and can I time that in? There's a whole series of scheduling things, and yes, you may leave it to the computer and the algorithm to do it, but actually you factor that in then with British shopping habits. The best weather forecast I've ever seen was Tesco's, for basically to be able to get the produce in the summer. If it's a grey day, we won't buy lettuces. If the sun's out and it's 30 degrees, everybody wants lettuces, tomatoes. So how do you bring that into your supply chain? There's got to be some human intervention in there, and we need the skills to be able to do it.
So do you think there's a bit of an image problem there sometimes with a lot of what we represent in CILT UK, where maybe young people in particular, or younger people, don't see exciting jobs that have the skills that they think they've got, whereas surely we're shifting now towards having some whizzy computer led kind of data driven professions for people. It's not all about driving things or stacking shelves in the warehouse, important though those things are, but there's other things that people can get into.
I think there's definitely a role here, and it's something for CILT UK. It's something for the many companies who are corporate members of the Institute to be looking at what can be done to promote. We talk broadly about the sector, but as we know, the CILT covers a very broad church of activity. Promoting what's involved in those sorts of jobs, as Ian has said. There are some absolutely fascinating roles to be had here. There's some very high-tech roles to be had here. There's some not that high-tech, but absolutely vital roles to be had here, which we hugely depend on as citizens, that people really value. And I just wonder whether it's both projecting how interesting those jobs are, how far, I go back to the technology point. Anyone who sat in the cab of a lorry recently, who isn't from the sector, will be astonished at the range of tech that's built into the cab, the amount that you need to know to operate one of these vehicles. But you don't need to be a big, strong person to do it.
Which is maybe the image we've got
and
in mind,
that's
isn't
the
it?
image issue that I think we need to address. It's an image of the sort of person who can do the job, but it's also the value that we as society hold for these people, because we do all like having things delivered. We like the fact that there's stuff in the supermarket. When we want to go and buy a lettuce on a sunny day, we'd like to think it was there.
And there's the thing of there are some roles which are less sociable. We talked about when are we delivering things. You don't deliver things overnight or late into the evening and be able to go out and have a good social life at the same time. Some of that stuff isn't necessarily compatible, and driving is sometimes a very solitary business.
Yeah.
And then when you do stop, you stop at a motorway service station. It's not exactly the most glamorous thing. So I think there's a lot of things that we have to do to try and make sure that, you know, the improvements in some of the infrastructure around is there, but also try and get away from the fact that, you know, transport in general is masculine, it's big and it's chunky. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And, you know, the options there need to be seen to be more open to people.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is how do we sell it to people? You know, it's been sold as, you know, there was always this thing, certainly when I was young, oh, would you know, supposed to want to be a train driver or something? Why? You know, there's some things here about, well, what is it that's in part of that supply chain? Where are the different roles? There's a whole series of things that we should be trying to sell to people about, not necessarily sell, but actually just encourage, you know, kids
just
to
make
get
it more
involved
visible,
in this.
isn't it? I think there's so many roles in everything that we do across, you know, across transport, logistics, the whole lot, where people just have no idea it exists. Like you say, in my sector, in rail, people think of drivers because they're really visible.
Yeah.
They maybe think of conductors because they're also visible. But the whole, you know, army of things that goes into planning and delivering a railway, most kids, when you speak to them, and we've done quite a bit on celebrating 200 years of passenger rail operations this year, so we've been out and about with the Railway 200 train, and you speak to kids and they've got no idea what's involved, you know, and there's jobs for all manner of engineers, of planners, of, you know, of marketeers, and of people who devise new products, of innovators that we need.
And there's the other side of all of this, which is the skills within the people who are setting the policy, who are within the retail
the thinkers,
chains, the people who are engaging with the logistics and supply chain. Because, you know, there's not, you know, for a logistics person, there's nothing else than trying to have a conversation with somebody and then not understanding what you're doing.
So that in-house development's really important for that, isn't it? So people appreciating, and it's one of the things I love about CILT is that you get to understand how the different things interface and how things are sort of interconnected, and having an in-house approach to developing talent can help with that, can't it? Go back to the shop floor, spend some time in different departments. Have you seen good examples of that over the years, Steve?
I think there's great examples of where companies make use of the tools, for example, the tools that CILT itself provides for training their own staff. I think companies taking responsibility for bringing people on, as Ian has said, of developing, spotting the talent that they've got after they've recruited them and realising maybe they could be steered in a particular direction and have their skills nurtured. I think it's really important that institutes like CILT provide that material and provide it in ways that people can easily access it. We increasingly see training materials being online, for example. I think for more senior folk, there's nothing quite like going back to the front line and realising what it's like and how it's changed, because we all do tend to look back to a sort of golden era of when I was doing that, it was like this, and actually the world has moved on. I also think, to pick up another point that Ian was making, we do need to think about particularly the world of the people who run our highways, the local highway authorities, the people in local government. They're under pressure as well. There's a lot of skill shortage in that world. And it is important that institutes like ours do what they can to help those people understand us, understand the pressures here. And a theme, again, that Ian mentioned, but that for joined up thinking. If we want to have people doing the important jobs that perhaps involve out of hours working, that perhaps involve overnight stays, and we don't provide facilities for them, at its very simplest, if we don't provide places where you can park a large vehicle and use a toilet, or in future, a large vehicle and recharge it, they are not going to be able to serve your town, your village, your city. And in a joined-up world of joined-up thinking, we need people to recognise we need to build those trips in, otherwise we won't be able to have the other stuff that we want.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned technology, we've mentioned AI, and, you know, we're running, aren't we? We're kind of running to keep up with some of those things. Do you see that we're doing the right things, or we're doing enough in terms of training in apprenticeships and degrees to kind of get to where we're at now and prepare for the future? Steve, what's your perspective?
Well, I think this goes back to the school curriculum, doesn't it? That we need to be gearing up our young people for the world of the future. And that's not to say that we should be trying to second guess every detail of it. Things have not necessarily worked out the way we might have predicted even 10 years ago. But there are some fundamentals that we would need to see built in. For example, I doubt very much whether it's as important now for young people to have the mastery of Shakespeare that was drummed into me many years ago by turn. I'm not very proficient at coding.
But equally, I've been amazed at how little coding they do. I mean, I've got two stepchildren coming towards the end of their school career now in GCSE and A level, and I remember them doing a little bit of coding when they were in primary school, I think you're supposed to call it, when they were little, but never since. And it's not a core part of the curriculum, which has surprised me actually.
And it's strange because I always sort of, my parents always said, oh, do a degree that was sort of like based on a job rather than just something general. But I think part of this is how people learn and what they learn. So part of my thought would be along the lines of, we need to just try and make sure there is something about supply chains and where things come from. There's a bit of disconnect between, we're lucky to have a garden, we've got produce, and the kids next door, when they were really small, would come and sort of actually be able to pull the carrots out so they could see where things were coming from. And I think that the connectivity to agriculture and stuff is incredibly important. And I think if you're in a rural area, maybe you get some of that, but I think a lot of urban children don't have that opportunity. And I think by understanding the supply chain, you then start to think about, well, how does that get to me? You
Maybe
start
that's
to
what
relate
urban...
to the product. So if you look at something like a grocery home delivery, you will be able to choose from over 100,000 product lines. Now, every single one of those product lines, there may be some that came from the same supplier, but they've been bagged separately or cut up separately. Each of those has got a slightly different trip to your front door. Nobody really thinks about the complexity of that. And you're still only paying, £5 for the delivery or something. You go, hang on, yeah. The product costs have got the delivery in to an extent, but
I wonder if your rural example of a kid in a rural community seeing the carrot in the garden is maybe the urban equivalent of that is the kids understanding how the stuff gets on the Amazon wagon, how does that happen? Where does that come from? Which is maybe, a little bit less about technical degrees and more about an understanding of the world and how it's all connected.
I mean, there's work that I used to work for DHL many years ago, and I know other companies do this, but they actually used to do this thing on truck and child safety of actually taking delivery vehicles and lorries and vans into school playgrounds so the kids could actually see the vehicle, understand the vehicle and know what's safe and what's not safe with the vehicle. So some of this stuff is about engaging in a different way, I think. But then within the sector is making sure that we're aware of what's going on by linking into, people do it into trade associations, keeping yourself professionally aware so that you can actually understand what's coming down the pipeline and make sure that you're equipping yourself.
I do wonder whether over the last 40 or more years we have gone down a path with education that's very much about having people prove that they can read things, they can therefore learn them, and they can to some extent regurgitate them, perhaps think about them, and not so much do them.
Well, do and critically appraise, because I take your point about Shakespeare maybe feeling a bit, abstract from the real world, so to speak. But if taught in the right way, even learning Shakespeare can be a useful skill if you're actually learning how to, critically appraise something, if you're learning how to, understand things in detail and then take them apart and put them back together again. I can see loads of transferable skills there, but what I see a lot of at the moment is kids just passing tests, and that's not the same thing.
That's precisely my point, that in demonstrating a capability, in some ways it's so much easier to demonstrate what we might think of as an intellectual capability, the ability to write eloquently or mount an argument, and perhaps not put as much weight or as much effort into those many people who, frankly, they're never going to want an office job, but they might well be part of a future logistics chain where their particular, the way their mind works, their interests, they might not want to be indoors all day, but by the same token, they might be absolutely brilliant at some of the things, operating some of the technology that's going to be the very basis of the sector in 20 years' time.
Right, I'm going to end with a question that's a bit mischievous. We spent weeks talking about this budget and it's finally here, and we've talked about EV charging, but I'm going to go to each of you and ask, what would you do with the black hole, or what would you have done if Rachel had come and asked you the day before, I need one final idea to include in this budget? Have you got anything on your list that you would have liked to have seen?
Ian can go first on this one.
Good pass, Ian.
I think it's, as I say, something which looks at a sort of a more strategic, long-term approach to it. It felt, without getting into the politics of it, trying to pick something from loads of different places, as a member of the public, I'd just like to know, the simple answer. What's happening with this? I don't need a tax on everything. Just tell me what it's going to be. I understand I need to contribute something, and what I get back.
Okay. More of a transactional approach, maybe?
Okay. I'd love to be able to identify the magic money tree.
Oh, yeah.
That would be some other source of government income that we haven't thought of yet that would be really simple. I don't think it's there. So what I would say is, insofar as we're going to have these motoring taxes, what the Chancellor has announced looks like a common sense approach to me. Quite how that will develop, and there's a whole lot of detail. So I guess I would say let's have some more detail of how exactly this is going to work.
The devil is so often in the detail, isn't it? So we're drawing in on the end of 2025. So very quick hot topics for next year. Steve, what do you think is going to be happening in 2026?
It's a very uncertain world out there. We've still got all of the problems in Ukraine, in the Middle East. That's going to be an issue for our sector because that's going to be at risk of disrupting international supply chains. And of course, we still have President Trump and the issue of tariffs globally. Domestically, I suspect we're not out of the woods financially yet. We would love to see some growth in the economy. That's going to be what obsesses our government.
Growth in the economy. Ian, anything hot topic wise from you?
So I think certainly the rollout combination of Great British Railways.
Yeah.
What happens in terms of the passenger movements. There's government plans on integrated national transport strategy and an update to their freight plan. How are those linked or not? I think will be interesting. And particularly, what's the way of identifying, with not much public money to go around, where's the spending coming, and is that spending, making sure that we're using the best of what we know and joining up the dots.
Some things to come back to there. That brings us to the end of this episode, and what a brilliant conversation. We've heard two expert perspectives on what this means for fleets, infrastructure, urban delivery, motoring costs, long-term planning, and a whole lot more. All the issues that go right to the heart of what CILT UK members are navigating every day. A huge thank you to our guests for sharing their insights and experience. These are exactly the conversations that we want to be having on the podcast. We want to open up conversations that help our profession prepare, adapt, and stay one step ahead of the change. And before we wrap up, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts on today's episode. Tell us what you'd like us to tackle going forward, and connect with us on LinkedIn. Join the discussion and let us know which future topics you think CILT UK should be shining a light on via the comments section on our LinkedIn page. Make sure to follow, subscribe, and share this episode with colleagues. We'll be back soon, I hope, with more conversations. And until next time, keep moving, keep thinking, and keep the conversation moving.